I'm Mark Halperin.
And I'm John Heilemann. And with all due respect to Hillary Clinton, I'm not wearing a wig either.
In the red corner tonight, it's Ben Carson versus Donald Trump, and we've got a boxing doubleheader, Marco Rubio versus Ted Cruz. But first, in the blue corner, Hillary Clinton versus Bernie Sanders. The top two Democratic presidential candidates had dueling speeches today. Clinton spoke here in New York about her plan to fight ISIS, and Bernie Sanders in Washington gave a long-awaited address on democratic socialism. We're going to talk about both those speeches in depth tonight and ask Democratic candidate Martin O'Malley what he thinks about all this later in the show. But first, let's start with that Clinton speech. The former Secretary of State spoke at the Council of Foreign Relations here in Gotham City, calling for, quote, a new phase in American efforts to defeat the Islamic State by expanding airstrikes, not ruling out ground troops, and urging Congress to swiftly pass an official authorization to use military force against the terrorist group.
Our goal is not to deter or contain ISIS, but to defeat and destroy ISIS. Our strategy should have three main elements. One, defeat ISIS in Syria, Iraq, and across the Middle East. Two, disrupt and dismantle the growing terrorist infrastructure that facilitates the flow of fighters, financing, arms, and propaganda around the world. Three, harden our defenses and those of our allies against external and homegrown threats.
John, what are your biggest policy and politics takeaways from the Clinton speech?
Well, the biggest takeaway I had from the speech is that apparently Hillary has finally recovered from that New York Times Magazine cover back in the 1990s by Michael Kelly, where she wore all white and was mocked for it. Apparently she wore all white today, too. Look, she's running a general election campaign already. That is a speech of someone who's trying to put the balance between being relatively hawkish, which she is for a Democrat, while still on the refugee issue, sounding like a Democrat and lining up with President Obama. She was not pandering to the Democratic base in that speech. She went about as far as any Democrat could go relative to the projection of military strength on this issue.
It was a strong day for her. In terms of policy, she and her team figured out how to distance themselves from the president without seeming disrespectful or disloyal. Right. She also showed great performance skills in the delivery of the speech. And while no one is free from potential attacks or vulnerabilities in talking about this very complicated topic, she laid down a bunch of markers that are sound.
Apart from people who will, in her party and elsewhere, who will criticize her role as Secretary of State and
where there is vulnerability
in terms of letting this whole crisis foment, that is a vulnerability. But in terms of from today forward, I don't see how she showed any. There's not a weak spot today where Bernie Sanders or Martin O'Malley are going to make a lot of headway, I think.
Yeah. It's still the case that she's not as specific as a president has to be in figuring out what to do. And she didn't cover, a lot of questions were begged. But in terms of going out there and saying, and as you suggested, showing a general election, muscular positioning against America's enemies right now, she was very strong.
That's right. And look, not as specific, but there aren't very many people who are being on the Republican side either who are being as specific as a president needs to be. All right. Now on to the socialist. Just hours after Hillary Clinton spoke, Bernie Sanders took the stage at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. to give a speech defining his controversial political philosophy. He invoked the legacies of FDR and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as he made the case for government's role in providing economic security for we, the people.
If we are serious about rebuilding the American middle class, if we are serious about reinvigorating American democracy, we need to develop a political movement which once again is prepared to take on and defeat a ruling class whose greed is destroying our nation.
So, Mark, this question will sound familiar to you because you just asked it of me about Hillary Clinton's speech. In terms of policy and politics, your biggest takeaway from the Sanders speech?
That he's got a distinctive worldview that's supported by tens of millions of Americans, and while people on the right and some in the center and the media will mock it and suggest it's communism, that he really does have a view that will find some currency. And I thought he did a nice job today of explaining what he sees democratic socialism as being.
Yes, I mean, look, I think that the speech was fine, but I have to say, there was not an element of it that actually qualifies as socialism according to what my definition of socialism is. I mean, he's not arguing for state control of industries. He's not arguing for like wild redistribution of wealth. He's basically he's a far left liberal in the mainstream. I still don't understand how the actual tag of socialist that he embraces actually describes his political philosophy.
He's for a very big role for government in lots of areas now where there's either limited role or no role whatsoever.
He's to the right of the French.
Yeah. And the thing I thought today that he failed to do in the stagecraft of it is there's nothing in it that would really capture the imagination. It was very solid, a lot of history, a lot of passion, but nothing that would capture the public imagination and say, wow, that's going to be trouble for Hillary Clinton to deal with.
I think there's the issue, though, of his political issue here is the political challenge for him is to defang the term socialism, right? Because it is just dangerous in and of itself. In that sense, if he has now laid down a marker, he can point to this speech and say, y'all who are actual socialists may not agree with me that this is socialism, but this is what I believe. This is my definition of it, and how I probably point to, if somehow he got to the point where he was close to being the Democratic nominee, he could define this level of socialism as something, a lot of Republicans won't like it, but it's not actually socialism, and that's probably for the best.
Yep. Look, he's got Hillary Clinton not on the run, but he has a case to make against her on a lot of the economic issues that he talked about today. And I'll keep giving a version of this speech. I think that the national audience, I think, gets Bernie Sanders as well as probably they're going to get him, even with this speech today. The key for him remains Iowa and New Hampshire. Can he take today's speech and the well-crafted lines that were in it more than he normally has and make it part of a homestretch message in Iowa and New Hampshire? Because we can say it every day on the show. Those are the states he needs to win to have a chance to be the nominee. Okay, today in Washington, the House of Representatives passed a bill mostly with unanimous Republican support, but also a sizable number of Democrats, that would make it harder for both Syrian and Iraqi refugees to enter the United States. The legislation calls for stricter FBI background checks for those who want to come to this country, as well as certification from the Department of Homeland Security before any refugees are accepted. The White House has threatened to veto and failed to stop 47 Democrats from voting for the bill, which already faces skepticism from some quarters in the Senate in both parties. Senator Harry Reid, the Democratic leader there, has predicted that the legislation will never reach the president's desk. John, there's more to play out on Capitol Hill, but does this skirmishing between Republicans on Capitol Hill, some Democrats, and the White House matter in the end?
I think it's unlikely to, and for this reason. The Senate now says, basically, what we're hearing from our folks there, Billy House, our Bloomberg's great reporter up on the Hill, says the Senate's probably not going to take up this legislation until after Thanksgiving. This, I think, is going to be a classic case of the House hot and the Senate kind of cooling things down. By the time you get there, Republican senators who think this bill is flawed in various ways, Democrats who think it's flawed in even more ways, by the time we get to the other side of Thanksgiving, assuming no other big world terrorism events, I think you could easily imagine this whole thing just fading away.
The White House did a briefing for the governors the other night, which cooled things down. I'm for, as a matter of just a public policy, when you have these white-hot situations where people's emotions are running amok, the White House and the administration need to smother congressional leaders and staff in briefings, get them to understand the facts, and when that happens, between that and the holiday, I do think this thing will cool down, and this fight and the House vote won't matter all that much.
The worst time to make legislation that's going to last for a long time is in the wake of a crisis where people are justly or unjustly panicked and
emotion being driven more by emotion than reason,
and trying to score cheap political points in some cases, and that always happens in both parties. It happens all the time. This, like I say, the holiday could not be better timed, I think, in the context of this, assuming, again, God willing, that we don't have some other event in the world that freaks everyone out.
Yep. Okay, coming up, Ben, Ted, Donald, and Marco, how those four fared in our brand new Bloomberg Politics national poll. Some interesting comparisons for you. Then our conversation about the war against ISIS with Democratic presidential candidate Martin O'Malley when we come back in 60 seconds.
Here at Bloomberg Politics, we've got more polls than a medieval jousting match. Our latest national poll numbers came out today on the Republican presidential race, and golly gee willikers, are they interesting. Donald J. Trump is still leading the Republican pack with 24%, up 3 points in September. He's followed by Ben Carson at 20% and Marco Rubio at 12%, who are both up a couple of points as well. We also asked people who took the poll to compare a pair of candidates side by side on a range of qualities. So let's start with the matchup between the co-front runners, Ben Carson and Donald Trump. two candidates on the opposite sides of the spectrum when it comes to personality and temperament. For an example of why we think people may have answered the way they did, take a look at this clip of Dr. Carson at Liberty University earlier this month.
The problems that we have in this nation, they're not Republican problems or Democrat problems. They're problems that affect all of us. And we have to recognize that one of the goals of those who want to fundamentally change our nation is to pull our nation apart. And you keep people at each other's throats. And then we forget what's truly important. What's truly important is our unity. And we have a lot more that unites us than the things that divide us. And we must remember this is United States of America.
When you see that clip and you get maybe a little bit of an idea of why, when we ask people who cares about people like you most, it's Carson whipping Trump, 65% for Carson, 23% for Trump. Mark, real quick, I want to get to Trump in a second, but does that matter? Care about people like you? Big Democratic, important in a Democratic race, important in a Republican race?
It's important in a Republican race for the kind of working class voters. This is the biggest surprise to me in our poll in the comparison between Trump and Carson. I thought Trump would do better on this score. A lot of voters you and I have talked to in focus groups and out on the stump think Trump really does care about them and about economics. This is, I think, Carson's the key to Carson's success right now, or one of them. People think he is caring. It's helping him at head-to-heads with Hillary Clinton. Yeah. He's getting surprising support from independents and some Democrats. This is an area where I think Trump needs to improve.
Well, I think it also helps him. It's, again, a variety of reasons why it helps him with evangelicals. It matters to them, too, and he's got a lot of support in the evangelical community. Those head-to-heads with Hillary Clinton, that's true. Now, let's move on, because there's a lot to talk about here. Let's look at Donald Trump speaking at a recent rally in Virginia.
We've seen our country where we don't win anymore, and we're going to start winning so much. We're going to win left, we're going to win right, we're going to win everything. We have unbelievable people in this country, and nothing is going to stop us from starting to win again. You look at what's happening with foreign countries. You look at how they're taking our jobs, how they're taking our base, how they're taking everything we have, including our money. You look at what's going on with the foreign, no matter what country you're talking about, they beat the United States. It's not going to happen anymore. It's not.
All right, so that's a typically emphatic Donald Trump. And again, perhaps not surprising, that kind of performance informs voters who say that when it comes to getting things done, 73% say Trump better on that score, 20% say Ben Carson better on that score. And Mark, this is consistent throughout this poll. On issues of kind of the soft personality, biographical, temperamental questions, Carson wins on better temperament, values to lead, honest and trustworthy. Trump, in every area where strength is involved, combating terrorism, dealing with Vladimir Putin, experience to be president, the economy, immigration, Trump wins, usually by a large margin. What does that tell you?
Getting things done, a huge margin there. This is why Trump's leading Carson in both national polls, I think, because while Carson has a lot of appealing traits for Republican voters, Trump is more appealing on more things, and I think more things that today matters to voters. Dealing with Putin, managing the economy, addressing immigration, combating terrorism, getting things done. Trump leads in all those, and some by a wide margin. And it's going to be hard for Carson to come back on those traits, I think.
I want to pull out one more, though, one question that we asked that was surprising in the sense that we didn't really know how it would come down. Those are basically predictable. Here's one we didn't know, which was the question of who would be better at dealing with Congress. Had no idea who that would be. So I am somewhat surprised. Ben Carson, 62% over Trump with 30%. That tells you that I think that Republican voters still think that a conciliatory attitude towards Congress is better than getting tough with Congress. That I find a little surprising.
Surprising, but I'm not sure how much that's going to help him in the current context. All right. We also wanted to compare the two rising candidates side by side, Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz. Unlike Trump and Carson, Rubio, where they're mixed on their results, Rubio does better than Cruz in almost every category we looked at, including one comparison on the question of who has the values to lead. So to give you a sense of what voters might be keying off there, listen to Marco Rubio speaking last weekend in Florida.
You cannot have strong people without strong values. The thing is, no one is born with strong values. Your values are taught to you, and then they are reinforced in you. And government cannot replace that. Government can tell you what's legal. It cannot always tell you what's right. Right and wrong, good and bad, that is learned from your values instilled in you in the family, the most important institution in society. And far too many of our leaders, quite frankly, in some instances in both parties, have forgotten that.
So Rubio beats Cruz there by 10 points, not a runaway, but by 41-31. Rubio does better than Cruz on a range of issues. You can see all this on BloombergPolitics.com. Better temperament, better dealing with Putin, working with Congress, and cares about people like you. All better for Rubio.
He's the aspirational candidate. Whatever you think about Ted Cruz, he's more of a critic and more caustic. Rubio is more optimistic. He's more aspirational. And I think that comes through in the places where he has the lead on those topics, on those areas that characteristics you just mentioned.
A few areas where Cruz is holding his own. Let's talk about immigration. That's a place where Cruz has an advantage. Here's an example of Cruz talking on that.
The Democrats are laughing. Because if Republicans join Democrats as the party of amnesty, we will lose.
So on immigration, Cruz beats Rubio. Again, not by a huge margin, 44-35. Cruz also does better on combating terrorism, the two ties on the question of experience to be president, getting things done, managing the economy. Where do you think Cruz needs to improve to try to cut the gap with Rubio?
Well, there's a wide range of places where it looks like he needs to improve, and one of them is the thing I said a second ago, needs to be more sunny, more aspirational, more optimistic. But it also, I think, tells you that this is why Ted Cruz is focused so much on immigration. It might seem obvious to people, but it's a place where Rubio is vulnerable, and it comes through in these poll numbers, and Cruz, I think, is going to keep pounding Rubio on that all the way through to the Iowa caucus.
To the extent we have a Cruz-Rubio face-off, which people are talking about, I think this foreign policy stuff, where Cruz has a lot of confidence on his positions, but Rubio is seen as better on foreign policy. No reason, I think, from Ted Cruz's point of view, why he can't close the gap on things like dealing with Putin. He's already ahead on terrorism. The trick for Cruz, I think, is you always want to play to your strengths and reduce your weaknesses. Right. Is where does he go? Where does he go? Does he keep playing on his strengths, or does he try to cut in on things like, for instance, better temperament and cares about people like you? Those are some tactical decisions the guy's going to have to make.
Absolutely right. Okay, up next, we will break down those Clinton and Sanders speeches that we talked about earlier with Ambassador Wendy Sherman, the former Undersecretary for Public Affairs during the Obama administration, when we come back.
With us now to talk about Hillary Clinton's foreign policy speech today, Wendy Sherman, the former Undersecretary for Political Affairs during the Obama administration. She is a supporter of Hillary Clinton's campaign, and she joins us from Boston. Ambassador Sherman, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Mark.
You have worked with both Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. Based on today's speech, not speaking about the specifics of combating ISIS, but just in general, how do you think Americans should anticipate a President Clinton, Hillary Clinton, differing from Barack Obama on national security issues?
Well, I think that Secretary Clinton said it right today. We have moved into a new phase, and by the time she's President of the United States, we'll be yet in another phase. And so what voters have to look for are what are the qualities that you want. And I think the strength of that speech today was to talk about the need for resolve, not fear. That's what President Obama's been about. But Secretary Clinton and President Clinton is going to take us into the next phase of what is going to be a long-term strategy. We've got to defeat ISIL in the short term, but there are lots of terrorists out there, and there will be subsequent groups that will arise as well. And so we have got to work with our partners around the world to really go at this in a quite concerted way. And I think she laid out that strategy today.
You've worked in a lot of places around the world, Libya, Somalia, Iraq, Afghanistan. Hillary Clinton, like a lot of people today, said we need to have a stronger coalition with local power, with local regional powers, regional fighters. Right? What are the challenges to actually making that happen? It's one of the things that everyone seems to agree on, but in the past, at least, there's been very limited success in the ability to get that done by any president.
Look, we have to build local capabilities, and that doesn't happen overnight. If you look at where we are and you watch that press conference in New York City last night, when the mayor and the police commissioner came out and said, we've got the best system, we have the resolve, we have the capacity, we know what we're doing since 9/11. We made enormous change in our intelligence system, in our law enforcement system. Europe has not been able to do all of that. They, of course, have porous borders. We have 2 oceans, which makes it a little bit easier for us. But nonetheless, we have to share those capabilities. We have to train people. There are many people in the Gulf who want to help to try to bring peace to the Middle East, but they don't have all the capabilities that they need. They don't know how to fight these kind of wars and how to fight terrorism. They haven't fought in that kind of a way for a very, very long time, if at all. So we've got to share those capabilities, share intelligence, build networks, go after not only defeating ISIL, but as Secretary Clinton said, we have to go after the infrastructure of these terrorist networks, and we have to make sure that our defenses at home are as strong as they can possibly be.
Can you clear up this question? Does Secretary Clinton support a significant number of American troops on the ground in Syria, and if so, to complete what mission?
What I heard her say today, and what I believe that she believes, is that we should rely largely for the boots on the ground to be the Syrian people themselves and the neighbors and those who have stakes in the region. I think the air campaign we're clearly going to lead. We hope that others will engage in it in a more robust way than they have in the past. We'd like to work harder with Turkey to close their border. She talked about no-fly zones, which will take a lot of tactical ability to ensure such no-fly zones and humanitarian safe zones for the people of Syria. We've got 12 million Syrians who are homeless right now. We have a staggering refugee problem, and of course people would rather them at home.
If I could stop you on the no-fly zone.
Sure.
If no-fly zones are such a good idea, why doesn't President Obama support them?
Well, Secretary Clinton answered that question as well. She said it's tough to do, but she thinks the conversation should be underway. And the Obama administration has had conversations with our partners and allies to think about whether there is a way to do this that is safe,
right,
that will not make targets out of refugees.
I'm sorry, excuse me. They're having conversations about it, but she supports it today. So what's the difference? If it's such a good idea, why doesn't President Obama come out for it rather than just having conversations about it?
Well, because he wants to make sure that it's doable. And Secretary Clinton today herself said in answer to Fareed Zakaria that we've got to continue this conversation. We have to put the specifics in place. We have to work to seeing it's doable. And importantly, she said, doing so would put pressure on Russia and Iran to come to a political resolution. Quite frankly, the military can ultimately, along with taking care of the infrastructure and defending our borders and defending our homelands, take care of ISIL. But there will continue to be civil war in Syria unless there's a political transition. As she noted, as others have noted, Bashar al-Assad has killed more of the Syrian people than ISIL has. So there is a political transition. We have to put pressure on that political transition and ensuring that we, in fact, try to create some solidarity and some solidity for the people inside Syria as part of doing that.
Ambassador Sherman, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
When we come back, Martin O'Malley joins us right here after this.
We are joined now by the man from Maryland, the boy from Baltimore, former Governor Martin O'Malley. Governor, thanks for stopping by our studio.
Thank you, John.
We are living now in the post-Paris world. You have a set of ideas for what you think should happen next. Tell us what they are.
Well, look, I think we need to do several things, and we need to do them all at once and better than we have before. Number one, and I think the President and John Kerry are working on this, is I think we have the opportunity to assemble a very broad coalition and perhaps to do it even through United Nations Security Council to up the battle rhythm in terms of the pressure on ISIL there in Syria and in Iraq. Secondly, we need to re-examine our protection of our own people here at home in the homeland. one. There actually is a role for our nation's governors and our mayors to play, and for Congress to play, and that is in improving homeland security, information sharing, and all of the things that go into homeland security in this new age of warfare. But the third thing we need to be mindful of is that when a nation is afraid, when terror strikes, one of the things that we're most in danger of losing is our character, our ideals, and our freedoms as a people. And we cannot allow that to become an early casualty of this renewal of strikes against Western democracies. So I, for one, believe that we have a humanitarian role to play here, and I believe that we should, in fact, accept our share of Syrian refugees, of the people that are fleeing the danger there. We need to do all three of those things.
Name one meaningful way in which your approach to this is different from Hillary Clinton's.
I would say that my background as a big city mayor and as a governor gives me a lot more experience, certainly on the homeland, and when it comes to sharing of information.
In terms of what you're advocating be done, how do you differ from her?
Well, I don't own the mess that it is, and I believe that as someone who has been in government, who has been Secretary of State, Secretary Clinton has to answer why it was that we haven't been able to better anticipate the secondary effects. Why is it that we did not have human intelligence on the ground? Perhaps we should have thought 2 or 3 times before believing that a change of regime is actually going to be better for the people of a region. My foreign policy as president would be decidedly less of military adventurist and decidedly more of a whole-of-government approach. And that's a fundamentally different way of looking at America's role in this world. So that's how we would differ.
Since Friday, there have been some French airstrikes, but I don't think we've got a full sense of how the French government plans to respond in dealing with ISIS. How would you like them to respond?
What I would like to see us do is to a short-term political settlement that allows us, and perhaps even through UN National Security Council,
Governor, I'm sorry, if I could, before you get to those phases, I'm talking about immediately now. How would you like to see France's military response go?
Look, the French are doing what they feel they need to do by way of strikes. But look, the longer term here is going to require coalition.
I understand, and I want to talk about coalition and Arab and all that, Arab element and all that. But what would you like to see the French military response be beyond the airstrikes they've already done?
Look, I'm not privy to the human intelligence on the ground, but in going after ISIL, you have to do it in a surgical way and understand exactly where their leadership is, where their communications are. I couldn't tell you, sitting here without that information, whether their airstrikes are hitting the right targets or not. And I don't pretend to tell you that I could, Mark. But I think what we need to do as a nation, what we need to do as a community of nations, is to coordinate the sort of special ops operations that are actually targeted, that have better human intelligence on the ground and goes after the leadership and the communications network, and also cuts off the funding, which I believe our government is starting to do, and doing a much better job in terms of striking the oil fields and the convoys and the like. So I can't. What needs to happen right now is for the world to come together in coalition, and we have a role to play there. I'm glad Secretary Clinton's come around to believing America has a role to play, which is something for some bizarre reason. She said this was not our fight in that debate, but we do have a role to play, and we cannot confront this evil in the world as a human family without the United States playing a leadership role here. That's what we need to do. What are we best at? I think we're best at the special ops. We're best at the air support, and other nations, especially in the region, Turks and others, are going to have to step up in terms of the ground elements.
Are you ruling out the idea of America as part of a coalition? Are you ruling out the idea of American troops on the ground? I supported the president on the special ops advisors just a couple of weeks ago, and I believe that we can play a role here. I believe, though, John, that one of the lessons we should learn from this last 15 years of conflict is putting large numbers of American soldiers on the ground often has the opposite effect of increasing the recruitment potential for the enemy here. So I don't believe that the answer here is going to be sending in the 3rd Division of Marines. It's going to be working in coalition with others, with the special ops,
and possibly close air support, and that in terms of that aspect of the theater. But there's broader issues that have to happen here. Look, we're moving into a whole new age of warfare and security and intelligence. The old way was very large institutions, very large armies, and the new way is going to be network security, networked intelligence, networked response in collaboration with other democracies and other countries in that region.
What makes anyone think, whether you think this or not, that large number of Saudi troops would go in on the ground and fight ISIS?
Well, we don't. Look, the shape of the coalition remains to be determined, but certainly ISIS has a destabilizing influence throughout that whole region and throughout the world, and poses a threat to all of the countries of that region. You look at the number of refugees that are now living in Lebanon, living in Jordan, living in Turkey.
It means they've got good reason to do it, but I just am deeply skeptical, based on the history of the last several conflicts in the region, that any American president, President O'Malley or any other president, could get Saudi troops to go into Syria.
Well, that's what diplomacy is all about, and I share your skepticism. And at the same time, events change, and there's a time, and there are inflection points where there's an opportunity to bring people together to focus on the true enemy and the true threat. And perhaps the Russians have reached that point. Lots of people are skeptical that the Russians can be part of a larger coalition, but with the downing of their airliner, perhaps they will. Perhaps they'll realize that the first priority needs to be ISIL and not the propping up of the Assad regime.
Let me ask you a question about domestic politics. Today, your campaign announced that you're going to be accepting federal matching funds. Makes you, I believe, the first major party candidate to do that since John Edwards back in 2007.
Or John McCain. Didn't John McCain apply? I think before he won the primary. I think he did.
Is that a sign of a financial desperation? Is that a sign of a campaign so low on funds that it must turn to the government to match?
Well, look, I've never been the big money candidate here. And what we are going to do, and what we always intended to do, is make our case to the people in Iowa and make our case to the people in New Hampshire. And history has shown that the results are often very different on caucus night than they are in the November before. We have a great staff on the ground. We have 37 young organizers. We announced a number of new endorsements, including Tom Henderson, the chair of the Polk County Democrats, which is Des Moines. So we have a lot of traction on the ground. These matching funds will guarantee that we're able to make our case to the people of Iowa. And then it becomes a different dynamic. And very clearly in this race now, no other challengers had this opportunity. I am one of only 3 candidates. Hillary Clinton, one of the more polarizing figures from our recent past, and someone who is very much involved in the mess that is our international situation. Senator Sanders, who is a nice man and a great voice for change, but never really accomplished any change. And then there is me. Yeah. I have the executive experience. I've gotten things done. I have a new perspective, and I'm not part of the polarized gridlock of Washington, D.C. And that difference is going to become very apparent, as indeed it already is on the ground in Iowa.
Governor Martin O'Malley, we are pleased you were here. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I've not yet had a chance to ask you what would have been the most newsmaking question, why you hate Tommy Carcetti so much. We're going to get to that, though, at some point later on this show. As I said, Governor O'Malley, thanks for doing this. More analysis on those big Clinton and Sanders speeches when we come back after this word from our sponsors.
More now on Hillary Clinton's big foreign policy national security speech today here in New York City. Here to break down and talk more about it with us is Jennifer Epstein, our ace Bloomberg politics reporter who covers the Clinton beat. First, though, let's take a more extended look at some of what Hillary Clinton said.
We cannot allow terrorists to intimidate us into abandoning our values and our humanitarian obligations, turning away orphans, applying a religious test, discriminating against Muslims, slamming the door on every Syrian refugee. That is just not who we are. We are better than that. And remember, many of these refugees are fleeing the same terrorists who threaten us. It would be a cruel irony indeed if ISIS can force families from their homes and then also prevent them from ever finding new ones. We should be doing more to ease this humanitarian crisis, not less. We should lead the international community in organizing a donor conference and supporting countries like Jordan, who are sheltering the majority of refugees fleeing Syria. When New York was attacked on 9/11, we had a Republican president, a Republican governor, and a Republican mayor, and I worked with all of them. We pulled together and put partisanship aside to rebuild our city and protect our country. This is a time for American leadership. No other country can rally the world to defeat ISIS and win the generational struggle against radical jihadism. Only the United States can mobilize common action on a global scale, and that's exactly what we need. The entire world must be part of this fight, but we must lead it. There's been a lot of talk lately about coalitions. Everyone seems to want one, but there's not nearly as much talk about what it actually takes to make a coalition work in the heat and pressure of an international crisis. I know how hard this is because we've done it before.
Jennifer Epstein, is Hillary Clinton in this speech and in general embracing the Obama foreign policy record or running from it?
She's doing a bit of both. She's kind of doing this difficult kind of dance that we could have expected her to do, where she once is kind of doesn't want to be, first of all, seen in headlines. And she, in the Q&A that she did after the speech with Fareed Zakaria, she specifically kind of said, when asked about headlines that have said that this could create a challenge for her, she said, you know, of course I disagree with him in the same way that any two people will disagree on things, just as I disagreed with him when I was in the administration. But she also used that to make a point that she wanted to do more on Syria when she was in the administration. And I think that we are going to kind of see her just kind of reminding people that she's a little more hawkish and maybe a little bit more aggressive. And that would be the approach that she would take versus what President Obama seems to be advocating for, which is a bit more pulled back.
Do you think that the Clinton campaign is prepared to take the kind of criticism we heard Martin O'Malley make here today, which is really a more traditional Republican criticism, saying she's got to own these crises that are going on? She was Secretary of State. Let's go back and litigate her record as Secretary of State. She owns this. Are they ready for that attack, or are they going to be a little caught off guard from that?
I think that they're ready for it. I think that they certainly saw David Brock out there today. He wrote a post on Medium, kind of going through her record and all the ways that she, worked on the refugee issue and so on. And I think that they do have defenses available, but it's kind of like the Wall Street issue that was kind of a big deal a couple days ago and should come back again. That there are just these vulnerabilities there that no matter how much they spin, no matter how much they push back, they're going to be there. But at the same time, I think that her team will say she's the only one who can even operate on this sphere and at this level, in this arena. So of course there are going to be things that didn't work out well and things that are still in progress. And she kind of got into that a little bit when she was asked about Donald Trump's criticisms of her, and saying something like the situation in Libya is still playing out. It's not over, and I think that that's kind of the way that they'll try to defend a lot of these things going forward, is to just say, all of these conflicts that she was involved in are still very much rolling on, and yes, there are problems, but there's also been lots of progress that's been made since she joined the administration. Quickly,
because we're almost done. Is this crisis, the post-Paris crisis, is it consuming the campaign, or are they still being able to focus on other things?
I think it's taken up a lot of their attention. I mean, this was obviously something that they very rapidly put together. I know that she's going to be in Tennessee tomorrow, and South Carolina, Iowa, and so on. She's trying to get back on the stump a whole bunch on economic issues, on education, before we get into Thanksgiving and a little bit of a window there.
So still doing both. Jen Epstein, thanks very much. Up next, our conversation with EPA Administrator Gina McCarthy, back in 60 seconds.
Yesterday, we spoke at a Bloomberg Politics event with the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, Gina McCarthy. Our conversation oscillated between politics and policy, so we're presenting you now with the Cliff's Notes version, starting with the hottest issue for environmentalists, climate change, and the people who don't believe in it.
Is there a way in the next year, do you think, to leave office where the divisions on policy and the inflamed rhetoric are lower than they are now?
People now understand, probably not because of what we're saying, but because of the impacts of climate they're already facing. They're recognizing that climate change is happening here in the U.S., and internationally, and that action's necessary. I think what has stifled us in the past has been that the solutions have not been readily available and marketable. That is no longer the case. They are not the complete solution to addressing climate. But you cannot disagree that there are states in the West that are choosing solar because it's less expensive than fossil fuel. You cannot ignore the fact that the solar industry is the fastest growing job sector. So we have solutions. All we're asking is to take a reasonable approach at looking at those solutions that make sense from both an economic and an environmental and many other perspectives, and let them play out. Let us say that this is where we know the present is and the future needs to head.
I don't recall an issue like this in my career. Your side, if I may call it your side, thinks the science is clear, and you look around the planet and you can point to countless examples of things you say, this is a direct result affecting real lives of real people. The other side doesn't agree with you. And I'm wondering if you can think of an historical parallel and whether you find it frustrating that the terms of the debate are not how to control what you and the president think is one of the biggest threats to the planet, but rather whether it actually requires action.
Well, I mean, much of the science that we have relied on for generations remains in question by some. And I don't want to get to some of the more modern ones because I don't want to get 25,000 phone calls as I leave. But let me just say there's still a flat Earth society.
But how do you feel about them?
I think that we need to recognize that there are going to be deniers. I think a lot of it in the past has been a denial because they're afraid of the consequences of that. I think we need to get beyond that. We want to continue to show that actions work, that they do not destroy the economy, that you don't have to worry about that. So let's just focus on the science.
As you listen to these Republican candidates talk about energy and the environment, is there one of them or more of them from whom you hear signs that you feel that they are enlightened, that they are somewhere in the ballpark of being decent on these issues?
Well, I mean, I listen to the debate, and I've listened to debates all my life, my whole life. I don't make my decisions on the basis of, at least not my decisions at EPA, on the basis of who I think is going to win an election.
Right.
I have to make my decisions on the basis of the science and the law, and that's what I'm doing. All I want is when someone becomes president, they have to take these things with the seriousness it deserves. There is a history of us moving forward under the Clean Air Act, and there is a history of us winning time and time again, and you're not seeing our large initiatives go down because a Republican has gone into the presidency or because Congress has decided to take it up.
Is the Senate vote yesterday meaningless to you?
The Senate vote yesterday is certainly something I'm going to pay attention to. Nothing that Congress does is meaningless.
What does it mean to you? How does it alter how you feel about things or think about things or proceed?
I think I have to look at the folks that voted against, and we have to continue to do a better job at explaining to them that what EPA is doing with this rule and everything else is protecting their kids' future. It's something they've cared about. You know, I myself have worked for many more Republicans than Democrats. Yeah. You know, there is a way of talking about the environment that makes it politically okay to be protecting your kids' future, as long as we're reasonable and rational and we're looking at economic consequences and we're aligning those with a bright environmental future.
So, Mark, this was a really interesting event we did in Washington yesterday with the Administrator McCarthy. What were your impressions of her? I don't know. I had never met her before yesterday. What did you think about her and how she handled the questions?
She's a good advocate for her position, but I think that whether purposeful or not, I thought she reflected a seeming lack of appreciation for the other side. Asked her about Mitch McConnell. We asked her about the vote in the Senate. I think that part of the problem that the administration has is this is an area probably amongst all the others where they've not been able to find much consensus. They've not been able to convince people who disagree with them on climate issues, on environmental issues, to meet them anything like halfway. And I didn't hear from her very much that suggested that she had a strategy for that beyond dealing with people who pretty much already agree with her.
Yeah, I mean, I thought even from the perspective from the environmental perspective, I think there was a certain amount of underestimation of the scale of the challenge, the strategy for trying to bring the world along, because this is a global global issue. I mean, there was discussion, but when we asked her very specifically about what looks like success from the climate talks coming up in Paris, the outline that she gave was very abstract and I thought not very persuasive from the standpoint, even if what you care about most is climate change, especially.
That having been said, she's a confident and strong advocate.
Oh,
for her position.
Yes, indeed, and a very strong communicator for sure. All right, we'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We say it every day, and we'll say it again right now. We are on the television set twice a day at 5 and 8 p.m., but we are live 24/7 on BloombergPolitics.com. When you visit that site, make sure you check out our campaign tracker for the latest 2016 updates. And at 6 a.m. tomorrow, we'll be releasing Democratic presidential horse race numbers from our national poll. Make sure you check that out.
Here on the program tomorrow, Republican presidential candidate, Ohio Governor John Kasich will join us in the studio. Until then, thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow. Sayonara.